Okay, so now let's welcome the second presentation. We have two speakers for the second presentation. The topic is cultivating globally minded educators. The first speaker is Dr. Christopher Brighton. He is the assistant professor in education management of Qian Liverpool University. And another speaker is Dr. Sarah Qian Wang. She is the program director of MA in Global Education at Qian Liverpool University. So Chris and Sarah, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lina. Let me just share my screen first. All right. So happy to be presenting our topic with my colleague, Chris. We have been teaching in this brand new program. And today's presentation, we'd like to have your attention and focus on the topic of cultivating globally minded educators, design and the challenges. So there are obviously two parts in our presentation. The first part is talking about the global education program that we have newly designed. Actually, the start of the design work was in around 2017, and after a long approval process, we finally was offering the program and got our first cohort just last fall. So it has been about 1 year. Chris and I have been teaching in this program, so there's lots of practical experiences that we like to share with the audience today. And for the second part, my colleague Chris will share some of the challenges that we have gathered by interview some of our current students, followed by our finding conclusions and the suggestions of how we can run a program like this in a transnational university setting. So I will start by talking about this concept of transnational university. I'm going to assume that most of the people in the audience are not familiar with the term transnational university, because it is for many of the people probably in the States, you know, educators and practitioners in the States are not really familiar term. Maybe it's more popular in the UK or in some parts of Europe. So the establishment of transnational university originally was exporting education as a type of a service or service/product. So it basically means that a home country institution, usually when we say home country, we sort of alluring towards the Western countries like the UK, the USA, the Australia, Canada, some of the developed Western countries, that institutions in those countries, they want to grant degree or degree programs to developing countries in the most sense. So they're exporting educational service, or they're you know, exporting their degree programs to hosting countries, and China in this case will be the hosting country. And there's some other transnational universities exist in you know, in the world, such as Malaysia that I know of, and Korea, and maybe even in Japan. So in parts of the Asian countries, the idea of transnational university is not an unfamiliar term, but I understand in some parts that maybe that's the case. So it is, I think it might be helpful to give some contextual background about the Chinese transnational education, which is very different, given the Chinese political and the social structure. So the first idea emerged in, the initial idea of transnational education emerged in 1993. That's when the Chinese government, you can say, actually had a piece of document concerning the cooperation of individuals from overseas to run schools in China. So that's very early primitive form of what we call now today transnational university. And it wasn't 2 years later the Chinese government start recognizing the great demand of transnational university, but still then there was really no official recognition of transnational university, although there has been some policy documents issued in the meanwhile trying to guide some of the local practices of building building universities or building cooperative programs in higher education. So about 2001, most of us probably know what happened is China officially joined the WTO. So as that result of that, China has to open many treats in terms of services and products, and educational collaboration is one of the things that has to be standardized in a way. So it was in 2003. Chinese Ministry of Education officially issued the very first, you can say, the guiding document or the regulation on Chinese foreign cooperation in running schools. It was until then the term transnational university officially entered the Chinese higher education sector, and shortly followed in 2006. XJTLU was built. If you were part of yesterday's special track presentation, you probably already learned that our university XJTLU it's basically been 15 years in running, and we're very young in the sense of higher education institution, but we're actually one of the first transnational universities, and probably I believe the largest transnational universities in China. And so you can see that in China, in the idea of transnational university has only been, somewhat officially in existence for about 20 years or so. And for a long while, since 2003 until 2019, there was really just regulation. It's not really law, not really any execution on reinforcing standards. It wasn't until 2019 a new policy came in place called the revision of the 2003 policy, and start really putting some measurements in the quality assurance issues and the performance standards of transnational university. So you can imagine there's lots of, probably at the beginning, confusion, if you will, and some exploration and also trials and errors. And most of the transnational universities or programs in China still very much follows the Western standards in terms of curriculum development and teaching and learning quality assurance. So having said that, some of you might wondering, why China is opening up to this idea of transnational university, and how does Chinese see the Sino-foreign cooperative cooperation in running schools. And literature has, said a lot of things about transnational university. And in summary, I think these are the 4 highlights. One is people in China sees transnational university as advantage in employment, especially for young adults, because most of transnational university are taught in a foreign language, English or some other foreign language, and mastering foreign language gives them a high advantage in the employment market. And the second is there's some sort of perception, if you will, assumption that transnational university is guarded by foreign institution. Therefore, there's a level of high quality assurance in education, comparing to some of the experiences they will receive from Chinese traditional universities. And this is a new momentum from many of the policy documents we can see issued by the Chinese Ministry of Education. They see transnational university as a stepping stone for China's higher education reform. If you can imagine, this is a new force coming in with a new approach to education, offering a new way of teaching and learning. So eventually, they're hoping that building transnational universities locally, they can expand their reach to influence local schools in China as well. And having said that, the Chinese government has always been driving this idea that when transnational university enters in China, this is a Chinese-centered transnational university, which is not necessarily the case in some countries. For example, in Malaysia, literature has shown that they basically allows the foreign university to run sort of like a satellite campus, and models everything after the foreign universities model. But in China, once the transnational university is built, a lot of things has to be modified and localized, and this is one of the reasons we're presenting our global education program. So now let me quickly talk about the design. When we designed the global education about 2 years ago, what was in mind for us? There is, if you look at the well, not higher education in particular, but education history, and looking at the historical development in terms of international education, you can see there's actually 3 major phases. One is what we call it colonialism, or international education under colonialism. Back then, this is about before World War II. There's lots of people that went overseas, especially from the Western countries, and they, when they got there, their family, their children have to have education in some way. So then international schools was really built to serve expatriates children and trying to give them a place to study in a sense. So the school, the international school, is built very much based on that idea, and it's a carryover from Western countries like the UK, for example. And then after World War II, there was a movement, triggered by the neoliberalism, and the idea of colonialism start moving into neocolonialism. And this era is no longer about taking resources from third world countries, but it's also about influencing third world countries with culture and ideology. So at that point, a lot of people, local people who had a bit more of economic establishment advantage, and they would see international schools or international education as another leg up for their children. So they either send their children to study in Western countries, or they send their children to go to local international schools with a very high paid premium. And in that, if it's an English taught curriculum, then English certainly is one of the advantage for future employment. But the world has been changing since then, and then the neoliberalism has been heavily criticized in the academic world, and many people are challenging the idea that neoliberalism still very much carries the if you will, the quote unquote white power or the white ideology. So now we're moving towards the post-colonialism, or we call it decolonization. And in this sense, is no longer just taking what's established in the Western world, but rather learn some of the best practices from the Western world and trying to localize it and integrate what's also valuable and equally important in the local context, and mixing it in an integrative way. So I think the Chinese transnational university is more on a line or on the spectrum of post-colonialism, while the Western initiative of transnational education was more of a direct product of the neoliberalism. So you can see there's 2 ends of spectrum, and we're moving gradually from one end towards the middle, or towards a more Chinese-centered transnational education at this point. So in our post-colonial design of global education, we're trying to emphasize the diverse national culture and the global perspectives. No longer we're looking only at what works in the Western world. We're also trying to incorporate what works nationally or locally, and in addition to what we can learn from the Western world to really form a holistic perspective. And there's the local culture embeddedness. It's no longer just, if we, for example, a British cooperative university looking at the British culture, or a US cooperative university looking at US culture. We're actually looking at, while studying at British sponsored university, we're still looking at the culture of Southeast Asia, for example, the Japan education system, the South Korean education system, and so on and so forth. And we're trying to highlight that it's no longer a dependency or codependency. There's the interdependency in the local or global education concept. And we're seeking for sustainable development, seeking for sustainable growth, constantly asking this idea, what works for China in terms of global education? What does global education really mean to students who are mainly coming from China and they're studying in this international university, things in that nature. So we have this trajectory of the future and the outlook looking into what works for the future, because we're really preparing talents, trying to graduate and step into the workforce possibly in 2 or even longer years. So we're not just to say what works or what has been worked, but more importantly, what would work. So this is a process of understanding, for individually understanding the self and others, and constantly negotiating between self-identity and others' culture identity, and trying to a balance, in the midst of some tensions, which we'll talk about later. And here is just a quick capture of IOC framework that actually aligns with our program design. There's a lot of words on the slide. What I want to highlight is there are 3 dimensions in our program design. One is about knowledge and understanding. And in terms of knowledge beyond theories, we also talk about theory connecting to educational practice. We especially highlight the change management aspect, and we want to also emphasize research through both practice-based research and empirical-based research. And the second dimension is about knowledge transfer, it's competency development. So there's a few highlights such as cross-cultural communication is very important, and be able to think, apply, act, connect critically between theory and practice, and trying to having this sense of integration of different cultural practices into this mixture of global ideas, if you will. The last dimension is that we, in our programs, really focus on building students' experience and the practical aspect through explore of cultural differences and giving independent learning opportunities. We have projects, we have internships, that's all for credit modules, trying to give students this opportunity to collaborate with each other and taking independent studies, which is very different. When we look at about 14 different programs offered in the UK, in international or global education, very few of them actually offers a 4-credit bearing module that's either work placement or internship. So this is just another additional highlight of our program. So I'm not going to repeat due to time limit. I think I will invite my colleague Chris to talk about, this grand design of ours that we have implemented for about 1 year, and some of the challenges that we have seen and what we think about these challenges. Chris?
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for that introduction and the background to the program. As Sarah said, I've been working with her for the past year on the global education program, and some of the research that I've been doing, if we move on to the next slide, has been about the challenges that the students have been facing with the program. Can you move on, Sarah? I don't have control of the slides.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I organized focus groups of the MA students. We have 61 people registered and 32 people took part in the focus groups. The focus groups were, conducted in a semi-structured way, in the idea of raising questions and getting the students just to discuss the issues that they have been facing whilst studying for the first year. So, as I said, there are a couple of things that I'm going to focus upon and talk about the challenges that the students have mentioned. So, we want to talk about the reasons for the students choosing this program. As you can see here, this is the some of the commentary that we've had. As Sarah has explained, the program is not necessarily a pedagogical course, well, a methodology course. It's more about the idea of education. But quite a few of the students were expecting this program to be more about global methodologies and global ways of learning. So they see the program as being very much connected with educational practice. On the other hand, quite a few of the students who had taken the program, they did understand the idea of the global education concept, and they were looking at the program as launching them into a PhD in an education-related area, not necessarily methodology, but more maybe about educational practice, educational leadership, business in education, etc. A few of the students, they were also talking about the reasons for choosing the program because they wanted to open their own educational institute or training center. For anybody who knows the Chinese market, this is a very big part of the Chinese market at the moment, and there are new training centers with new ideas opening all the time. And so each of those training centers needs to have a niche or some sort of catchy idea behind them. So some of the students were saying that by taking the program, they were hoping to get an idea of new trends, new directions in education around the world that they could then bring into the local market and use it as a tool for launching their own center. We move on. Some of the other things about the expectations, what the students actually expected to be doing in the program when they were looking at the program description and thinking about what it meant for them. Quite a few of the students wanted to have more international and a bigger exploration of different national systems. There has been a discussion both internally and also with the students about the idea of whether this is a Western education program and whether Western education is what we are teaching, or whether we're looking at things in a much broader sense, not just focusing upon, say, the UK, Europe, and then the USA, and looking at different education programs and different education ideas in a more global aspect. Many of the students did highlight, as has already been highlighted, the innovative and creative ways of learning. For example, the internship was very much something that the students were attracted by and thought was a very interesting idea. But quite a lot of the students, again, they were saying that they don't really have any direct expectations. This was just a program that they saw as being interesting and different, and so they wanted to try something. We don't really have any information directly about this, but most of the students who are taking the program, their background is not necessarily in an education-related field. So for them, this was something that was, a new direction, a new way of looking at their future career. Okay, moving on. The adapting to the requirements and the teaching style and the learning style, that has been something that I think most of the students have found quite challenging in different ways. A lot of the students have commented about the heavy workload, the preloading of materials. The flipped classroom idea requires the students to do a lot of reading and preparation in advance so that they can come to class and have discussions. Remember that the classes are supposed to be done in an EMI environment, so it's a second language for the students, and so that creates its own challenge discussing these ideas in English. And on top of that, having to read quite a lot of material in English as well. The students have used translation apps and translation programs to try and get to grips with this, but it still is quite a lot of material that they are saying that they have to deal with up front. Some of the students have also struggled, they've said, about their idea of critical thinking. there has been a discussion amongst the focus groups, and some of the commentary that we have in the transcripts does point to the students misinterpreting the idea of critical. Some of the students think that critical thinking is to criticize and to find an alternative point of view, whereas the type of criticality that we're asking them to think about and to develop is to be able to analyze, to relate information, and to understand what information actually means. So this is leading to the last point about the students making their own connection between things. This is something that, again, some of the students have said they found quite different to their previous study. For example, in the classes, when you say to them that there is no right or wrong answer to this question or to this issue, the students feel that there's an ambiguity, and they would rather have something that is concrete, black and white, a clear direction. So those things point to certain issues with adapting to the ideas and the requirements of the program. If we move on to the next one, which is about the teaching style, this is quite interesting for me. I am the only native first language speaker on the program, and they said that the students have said that they wanted to have a native speaker. They thought that the idea of a native speaker or an English speaker was very interesting for them and something they wanted to be part of, but then meeting a native in person has been quite challenging. Some of the students have told me that I am the first foreigner, foreign speaker of English that they have met physically, and they have found it quite unnerving at times, and being a little bit more adapting to the ideas of working in this type of environment. As I mentioned, the student-centered environment as well puts a little bit more emphasis upon the student doing the work in preparation, so that they have to be more active about things and more prepared with the information, so that they can come into class and discuss and to get involved in activities. So they like the idea of it being student-centered. That sounds interesting to them. It makes them feel important. But when it comes down to reality, what a student-centered learning environment means, they find that a little bit more challenging, because some of the shackles, some of the restrictions, some of the guidance that you give as an instructor is removed, and the students are the people who are supposed to be developing their own thoughts on these issues. One of the other questions and the other things that has come up very recently has been about the different type of assessments. A lot of the students, probably because they are second language speakers, have commented about the essay writing requirements, and that much of our assessment is based upon written assessments, and they would like to see different types of assessments, such as more video construction, or shorter project-based, or as was being mentioned before, a portfolio style of development. So these are things that they are having to adapt to in the structures that we have. Moving forward, moving on. So there were a couple of thoughts about this that leads to some of the positives. I think that the students are dealing with the learning challenges, and they are looking at ways to adapt. In the focus groups, when we've asked them about how they have adapted and what they have been bringing in to adapt, they've talked about communities of practice that they have developed, and stepping up to learn how to deal with these challenges that they are facing and to overcome these these blocks. They've also spoken about how in the first semester they did find critical understanding quite difficult, but as they have progressed and as they have taken more time in the program, this has become more natural. Our program is only 18 months, so there is like 1 year of classes for the full-time students and 6 months of MA thesis writing. So by now, after 1 year, they're beginning to understand the criticality, they're beginning to understand the self-directed learning, and they're just reaching the end of the program. So the learning curve needs to be accelerated, and we need to think about that for the future. The negatives, I think that the negatives are quite clear, and it is to do with the students and the aims of the program. They misinterpreted the aims, some of them, not all of them, but some of the students have misinterpreted the aims, seeing global education as a methodology program to compete with like a MA in TESOL or an MA in English language teaching. And some of them have expected something other than has been delivered. They wanted more practical, methodological, pedagogical based instruction that they could then take back into their classrooms or take back into their private classes and practices and implement straight away. Whereas the ideas of the program and the idea of the MA has been a little bit more looking at global issues in education, looking at the global concept of education rather than something directly related to methodology. So Sarah, we're coming through to the conclusions.
Okay, that's thank you, Chris, for sharing the findings. So based on Chris' findings, and we had a discussion about what this is all means. So we're putting something together through, this picture captures, the hourglass where we can see there's big differences between grand idea and reality. Earlier I talked about there's a tension, there's a two spectrum, there's a dynamic, there's tension, push and pull. So we also see from students' feedback, the global issue of MA program, the idea of global is really different from the designer, if you will, from perspective versus students' perspective. And that said, there's differences between when we look at curriculum from the UK versus transnational universities. And we think that, this we can kind of frame it or look at that this is a developmental process for both educators and the students, that they are struggling with their identity, their learning practices, and their idea of what critical thinking should be about. They're developing their learning, and they're sort of moving towards more of the program aims in the meanwhile. So this is somewhere meeting in between in the actual practice. And I think one of the things that we want to bring forward, which is not much talk about in the literature, is how to deal with these sort of tensions between the ideas, the aims, and actual practice. And after a year launching the program, and we just recognizing, sometimes what we want to do is not exactly perfectly presented in reality, and we're facing a lot of these local challenges. So balancing will be a good way to deal with these sort of tensions. As if we would recommend for a future path, I think dialogue is one of the importance, and Chris actually in the discussion, I think is a great idea to include dialogue between teachers, students, and program, university, and maybe even the public. Because the idea of global education, everyone thinks, sort of every family unit, if you have children or sometimes you don't have children, you will think education as relevant to you. And that same characteristic carries over to global education. But when we talk about education or global education, everyone comes up with their own definitions. So the only way to really get closer, get some clarity is through dialogue. And supporting the growth of both teachers and students. Just as students struggle, inevitably teachers, especially maybe foreign teachers, will also struggle who are unfamiliar with the Chinese culture. So encouraging different directions and just really to embrace the dynamic or differences, if you will, in some ways that we're constantly keeping an eye on this balancing act between the two spectrum, the tensions, trying to see if this is something we can resolve quickly, or something that we will have to carry over. In that case, the constant struggle will become in a way a norm in transnational education context. So that basically concludes our presentation on our idea and the challenges in cultivating globally minded educators. I think, Lina, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Chris, for the excellent presentation, for sharing the details of the design and the challenges with the audience. We've got questions both in the Q&A and the chat. So we will back to the questions at the end. And we can see we have a question from Charlie for Chris. Charlie, do you still want to ask this question?
Hi, Lina. Chris answered me privately, but I can speak to it a little bit. Is that let me get to where the question is. It was surprising to me that critical thinking is still thought of by some students as being nitpicking or pettifogging, in fact, argumentative. And this was one of the original translations of being critical, like self-criticism. However, generally, I think when we talk about criticality, it's about careful judgments. So some students still don't get it as such, but the bigger issue is just sort of pedagogical backgrounds from different educational systems. So going from being overly critical as finding fault to making careful judgments is much less of an issue in higher education in like a transnational context than the idea that you would have to make careful judgments not just provide a right answer, like what happens in high schools here, this type of thing. So that's the background. I think Chris might be gone. I don't know, but that's how our private conversation went. Great, Chris. Do you want to add anything, or are you good with that?
Yeah, I'm pretty good with that. I mean, that's what we've been trying to teach the students, that criticality is not searching for something, but it's about, making sure that you have a coherent argument, that you have the points, and that you put forward what you think is the right opinion on your side. So that you bring together all the bits of information that you have, and that's what we're trying to get the students to try and understand, that there is no ultimate right and wrong answer. It's not black and white, that very much it's how you can argue a case and how you can bring the information together, and that's what counts.
Excellent.
Thank you, Charlie and Chris, for sharing your thoughts on this very important question.